Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I want to remind you again to send Charlie Fabian, our support help volunteer, who takes your ideas and suggestions for possible future programs, questions, and relays them to us. It's a wonderful service he does. You can reach him at your leisure, charlie.info438@gmail.com. I also want to let you know that our new book has been released. It is my own book called Understanding Capitalism. It is literally the fruit of a lifetime of teaching, learning from being a teacher, which is a crucial part of anybody who's a teacher, and also what we've been doing on these programs. It's an attempt to answer your questions, the problems of capitalism, the mythology around capitalism, where it's going, what will come after. All of those kinds of questions are dealt with systematically in a style designed to be easy for you to approach and think about. Understanding Capitalism, available now from our website, democracyatwork.info/books. Today's program is going to be talking about U.S. sanctions around the world. Do they work, this kind of economic warfare? A decision by the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, to join with the United Auto Workers in preparing for what is not that far from a general strike, which is now becoming part of the reality of the American near future. And finally, to do a proper job on the nonsense coming from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about a quote-unquote labor shortage in the United States. You're going to be hearing a lot about that, unfortunately, and I want to equip you to understand the hustle that is perpetrated by that phrase. And then in the second half, we're going to have an interview with Clara Mattei, an economics professor in Brazil for the G20 meeting there. Actually, she's there with protesting events because of the G20, talking a good line, but doing very little, with perhaps the exception of their host this year, President Lula of Brazil. That's in the second half of today's program. Okay, let's jump right in. The Washington Post carried an absolutely unusual story on July 25th, 2024. If you can go back and use your computer to get a copy of this article, do so. You will learn an enormous amount of material you would not otherwise have presented to you in most cases. The title of the article, How 4 U.S. Presidents Unleashed Economic Warfare Across the Globe. Here's how the story goes. Clinton did a little of economic warfare. Bush did more than Clinton. Obama did more than Bush. Trump did more than Obama. And Biden did the most of all. What's the it here? What did they do? They wage economic warfare. That is, they don't shoot, they don't kill, they don't bomb. But what they do is they make economic difficulties. They refuse to buy what they used to buy. They refuse to sell what they used to sell. They block investments in a country. They block that country from borrowing, and on and on. Economic warfare, often referred to as sanctions. The general term sanctions varies into what ways you sanction. The United States today, as I'm speaking to you, has over 15,000 sanctions in place. That is more than 3 times the number of sanctions of the country in second place, which is Switzerland. China and Russia, our enemies, have no sanctions in place. So, this is economic warfare initiated, developed, expanded, perfected by the United States. All in the name of defense, of course. But who's fooling whom here? When you make economic difficulties for other countries, you do so because you have a political objective in mind. And you can't or don't want to use diplomatic force, diplomatic argument, or even military force or military argument. You're choosing economic warfare rather than other kinds of warfare. Famous examples where this is often credited with having really helped achieve the political objective was the end of apartheid in South Africa, when the Western world and much of the rest of the world effectively froze the South African economy. Wouldn't buy from there, wouldn't sell to there. It is not difficult to get around sanctions. That reality has been true for as long as sanctions have been there. I'll come back to that in a moment. Serbia under Milosevic. There have been cases where political outcomes were achieved in part by the effect of sanctions. It's clear that you can do enormous damage to a country. Cuba, which has had sanctions uninterrupted since 1961. We're talking over a half century of sanctions by the United States against Cuba. Certainly did a lot of damage to the Cuban economy. Sanctions have done a lot of damage to the Venezuelan economy, and there are other examples. But it is important to note that the sanctions mostly affect the mass of people. The leaders of these countries are not affected by sanctions. They will eat well, sleep well, dress well, travel well. They're not immediately affected. They may suffer from the upset, anger, deprivation, poverty of the mass of their people, which may be blamed on them. But if they have any brains at all, and they are usually smart enough, they make sure that the suffering sanctions caused to the people in these countries are blamed on whoever applies the sanction. Okay, now, friends, I got a hint for you. If the United States is number one in the world in imposing sanctions, if it imposes 15,000 sanctions on countries, on companies, on banks, even on individuals, where do you think those 15,000 subjects of sanctioning, where do they focus their anger? On the United States. And since many of those people are newspapers or control newspapers or affect the culture in their countries, the anti-Americanism that follows from this ought to have made intelligent people question sanctions in the first place, on the grounds not put aside their moral implications. Children can't get milk. People starve. And these are not exaggerations. But even the political, the blowback, the anger, the bitterness, wow. So I think it's part of the decline of the West. That's the point I want to make. You can't use nuclear weapons. It's self-defeating. You can't use conventional weapons because many of our potential adversaries, and particularly the Russians and the Chinese, would be and are showing themselves already to be formidable enemies. That's what Ukraine is teaching. That's conventional warfare. What's left? Nuclear, you can't. So sanctions become not the choice, but so much the only one left to use. And maybe that's why nobody asks, is this an effective measure? Because if you were to do that and you were to conclude, as many have, that it isn't, well, then you're left with nothing. And the West, being in decline as the East rises, doesn't want to come up with nothing. So it comes up with sanctions. Don't be fooled. At its annual meeting, the American Federation of Teachers voted on a resolution that from now on, contracts that the teachers in the AFT sign with school boards everywhere in the country should have an expiration date of May 1st, 2028. Why? Because that's what the United Auto Workers did in their contracts with Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, who now own Chrysler. They want these contracts to expire all on the same day so that workers can support each other. All of them go out on strike with the impact on the American economy much greater than what any individual union could achieve. It's just the logic of unionism, the logic of collectively bargaining taken to its next step. Corporations get together in all of their associations. Why shouldn't unions get together and plot their strategy? The resolution was proposed by the Teachers Union of Chicago, a leading progressive union in Chicago, in the Teachers Union, and in the United States. If you're interested, go read the resolution. It's all about workers uniting to fight the employers who have been savagely attacking and undermining workers' well-being in the auto industry, in the public sector where the teachers are active, and so on. Remarkable movement toward what? Toward declaring on May 1st, 2028, a strike not here or there or over there, but a general striking of as many unions as follow the AFT in joining with the United Auto Workers. Finally, there's this bizarre statement in June of this year, 2024, by the United States Chamber of Commerce declaring a labor shortage. There are not enough workers, they're telling us. They're really telling the government, do things to get us more workers. And what is it they think they're going to do? Well, after the pandemic, we know what they did. They took away the extra supports that we gave workers in the pandemics, the extra unemployment compensation, the extra benefits of all kinds, the rent moratoria. We helped the working class. Dare we say so? But all those were taken away. So what will they be wanting to do, knowing the Chamber of Commerce? They'll be wanting to take away more benefits, put the workers under a greater squeeze to solve their financial problems by, working more jobs, taking a job if you don't have one, all of that. The labor shortage is a fraud. You know what it means? What the real truth is? Employers are not willing to pay people to come to work. Labor force participation in this country is down. Why? You want to solve the labor shortage problem? Do what we teach in economics. There's not enough supply. Raise the wage. You'll get more. Pay more. What the labor shortage argument really boils down to, we want more workers and we don't want to have to pay more to get them. Gee, wouldn't that be nice for the employer? It's not nice for the employee. That's what labor shortage is about, helping the employer at the employee expense. Don't be fooled. We've come to the end of the first half of today's program. Stay with us. We'll have a fascinating interview with Professor Clara Mattei when we return. Friends, I don't want to insult your intelligence. I know that you know that it costs money to produce these programs, to have the people working on the different aspects that lead us to deliver a show every week. please help us if you can, for whatever amount you can. It's really easy. Go to our website, democracyatwork.info, and there you'll see the ways to donate. And likewise, go to Patreon, where Democracy at Work has a really fine audience that is supportive of us, and we ask you to consider joining them. Thank you. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. I am very pleased and honored to bring back to our microphones and our cameras Professor Clara Mattei. She has been on our program before, and your response is part of why she's back here again. She is an associate professor of economics at the New School for Social Research in New York City, and she's the incoming director of the Center for Heterodox Economics at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma, starting in January of 2025. Her first book, published in 2022, entitled The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism, was praised as one of the 10 best books of the year by the Financial Times, which, given its critical approach, is a remarkable achievement all by itself, as well as receiving the famous Baxter Prize of the American Historical Association, and it is currently being translated into 10 different languages. Last year, in November, Clara Mattei published her first book, written directly in Italian, L'Economia e Politica. Its soon-to-be-released English translation will read Anti-Capitalism, the Most Powerful Idea in Modern Economics. I'm going to be asking her about that in the questions. Finally, her current book project reassesses the golden age of capitalism, so-called, post-World War II, 45 to 75, and the Keynesianism that was its economic rationale. Her writings have appeared in The Guardian, Jacobin, The Nation, and Il Fatto Quotidiano, an Italian national newspaper that she contributes to regularly, and she also writes a monthly column for the Swedish national paper Dagens. So this is a very busy person, and therefore let me begin by thanking you for taking the time to talk with us today.
It's a real honor, as usual, Rick.
So let me jump. Because of this program and because of what's in the news, many people are aware that there are momentous changes going on in the world economy. The dominance of the West, of the United States above all, over the last 75 years is now clearly in decline. It is being challenged again for the first time in 75 years, if not more, by a serious competitor, the People's Republic of China, and its allies, the BRICS. So it is particularly interesting that you are in Brazil, one of the BRICS, that there is a meeting of the G20 going on in that place, that it includes the kind of progressive approach of a President Lula, but also the presence of all of those trying to hold back the changes that are going on. In that context, and with you in Brazil literally participating, I wanted to start off by asking how you see the global significance of the two wars that are screaming across the front pages of the world these days, namely the war in Ukraine between Russia and the West, basically, and the war in Gaza between Israel and the Palestinian people, more or less. How do you understand them as reflections, as chapters? What sense can you help us make of those obviously very destructive and very troubling phenomena?
I think both conflicts, and especially the current genocide in Gaza, are moments of epic importance for the exposure of the truth of our economic order and those countries that are hegemonically supporting capitalism as the economic order. The level of epistemic violence that populations around the world, and especially in the United States, are having to deal with in terms of denial, even of the sheer numbers of children and women that are dying daily in Gaza, is for me really atrocious. And it speaks again to this complete disconnect between an oligarchy of the ruling elite that tries to hide what is under the eyes of anyone who opens their social media devices and who can consume the tragedies of children dying of malnutrition and starvation and others under the rabble. So what is particularly interesting here is that there is a effort that is really uniting the whole of the elite of the Western Front to hide the current massacre that has reached levels of violence against children and civilians that are unheard of. And it's actually Lula, the president, who exposed this incredible co-option of the entire West with the genocidal project of Israel early on. Lula actually said that something like this had never occurred in history, but of course with the Holocaust and the killing of Jewish civilians. So it is really interesting to see how it is in these countries that are outside of the subservience to the American order that this epistemic violence is released in the whole spectacle that it represents. In the meantime, I think the genocide in Gaza is also revealing the most important truth of our economic system, which is that we are living under a system that does well, that thrives economically through the sacrifice and the literal murder of the innocent and the majority. Indeed, while we have polio spreading, lack of water, and the war, starvation war, we have all of the big shareholders celebrating because actually the war on Gaza has been extremely profitable. And it is actually incrementing the prospects of investment in the region. The project of Gaza 2035 that Netanyahu released is literally terrifying. It is about the building of infrastructure, logistics, incredible expectations of economic growth and capital accumulation at the expense of the people. And this is really important because the shares of Lockheed Martin increased 25% since October 7th. Other companies that are directly involved in the slaughter of children have shares that went up 50%, like RTX. So this is, I think, really a watershed moment in which the idea that the West can represent some form of universal, moralistic point of view is completely crumbling. It is clear that the West is supporting capital accumulation in its crude, violent repercussions on people and on the climate.
I'm struck, by that famous remark of Marx's about how capitalism came in the world dripping blood from every pore. His point was to say, don't be upset, don't be surprised that the revolution against capitalism has war and violence in it. That's how these systems come into the earth. Anyway, you are in Brazil, where there are two remarkable things. You've mentioned one, Lula, who's taking a fairly strong position about this changing world economy. But Lula is also the reflection of a vast amount of political movement and radical organizing landless workers, people who fight against dams, who are pushing against that kind of capital accumulation you spoke of. Have you developed a sense of that reality as going on in Brazil and as something being replicated in where the majority of the people on this planet live, namely the so-called global South?
Yes, this is what is really fascinating about the Brazilian context, because you see the struggles within and against capitalism at all levels. So while we have the government who is attempting social redistribution, but is in the morse of mostly internationally imposed austerity and speculation of private foreign investors, we have on the ground movements that are both trying to pressure the government in actually fulfilling the social measures it has claimed to do and so far has not done because of the need to constantly cut social spending. Lula is now in the phase in which he's telling us that there is a need to get to a zero deficit by 2025. So has frozen wages of, for example, public employees and universities and keeps freezing them and has curtailed expenditures. But at the same time, Lula is very sensitive to these movements that are really movements that understand anti-capitalism in a very concrete way. There are a number of incredible mobilization efforts. Of course, there is the very famous movement of the landless rural workers that has been active since the 80s, but now more than ever is also vocal on Gaza and is reuniting the idea that ecological self-management of the territories after they have occupied and reclaimed land is about feeding people in an ecological way and bringing this food also to those in need. So we have this MST, the landless rural worker movement, that is enormous. It involves 350,000 families and keeps growing. And Lula is directly, of course, in connection with them. Then we have of course, the one of the most interesting self-management of industries movement. After Argentina, Brazil is one of the biggest. And there's 10,000 workers or more involved, over 50 industries, more or less, right now that are directly controlling the means of production and trying to produce for use. There are a number of other incredible efforts. Very important is the MTST, the movement of homeless workers, workers who work to bring indeed value to their own countries, but are left without homes because of how the city, they claim, is managed like a corporation that is interested in maximizing financial rent and real estate rent, and thus excludes people from their basic rights. So this movement of homeless workers has actually occupied in the last years many unused homes and is self-managing canteens, vegetable gardens, is really trying at once to self-govern and to pressure once more the government to build more housing, to give jobs. The housing, the public housing are being built by the same workers who are then going to be living in these houses to reclaim against real estate speculation the right to basic needs. These are just some. Of course, you mentioned also the very big ecological movement to protect against the ecological disasters of dams breaking down. That has been a very big reality in Brazil. And so the idea of popular energy projects, of, again, a sense of sustainability, that also the big movement of the trash recycling and trash pickers is trying to bring forward, and is another very interesting reality. So we see how the Lula government is energized by these seriously alternative minded, poor workers who are living on their own skins the contradictions of capitalism, but yet his effort to mediate with capital investors who are trying to tell him to pursue and continue pursuing high interest rates. Now there is the big battle of who will come to the central bank in Brazil after NATO leaves. And of course, the eyes are all on Lula to say, if you do not act according to orthodox economics principles, we will speculate against you and you will hear the repercussions. So this is the battle, I think, that a country like Brazil is fighting, and is very exemplary of the current struggles we need to pay attention to also in the United States.
Clara, I wish we had more time. We've already run out of time. I'm going to have to bring you back because I want to hear about anti-capitalism as the most important or most dangerous or most powerful idea, the title of your new book. So we'll do that on another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Rick.
I hope this has been as interesting for all of you as it has been for me. And as always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.